Antes de darmos início ao evento, gostaríamos de reforçar o seguinte disclaimer. As manifestações expressas por integrantes dos quadros da Fundação Getúlio Vargas e por convidados que participam dos eventos e transmissões online representam exclusivamente as opiniões dos seus autores e não refletem, necessariamente, a posição institucional da FGV. Após este vídeo de aviso, solicitamos a autorização para o uso da imagem e da voz dos palestrantes mediante manifestações de concordância, tais como um aceno de cabeça ou outro gesto de aprovação. Agradecemos sua participação e desejamos um excelente evento.
Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are watching this webinar from today. Welcome to this webinar on cooperative digital sovereignty and artificial intelligence that is organized jointly by the Center for Technology and Society at FGV Law School Rio and by the Digital Cooperation Organization. My name is Luca Belli. I'm professor here at FGV Law School. I have the pleasure to be the leading author of the study that will be presented today that is developed together with DCO partners. So before I pass the floor very quickly to my colleague and good friend Ahmad Binder, I just wanted to ask all the participants to this webinar to express their consent by either nodding or doing this gesture for the image to be captured and their voice to be used. Fantastic. So please, Ahmad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are in the world. And I can see we are quite a few time zones apart. So on the behalf of the Digital Cooperation Organization, it is my pleasure to warmly welcome all the participants, distinguished panelists, and our colleagues from FGV and from the other entities on this very timely discussion on corporate digital sovereignty. And I look forward for us to have really meaningful discussions and some great takeaways from today's webinar.
Thank you, Luca and Ahmad, from the warm welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of our panelists and to everyone watching us live or later through the recording of this session. Please allow me to briefly introduce myself. I'm Felipe Medon. I'm professor at FGV Rio Law. And together with Luca, I also coordinate our newly created AI Hub. It's an honor to welcome you all and to moderate this panel. So my role here will be to ensure a smooth transition between the panelists and to keep track of our time. And we have gathered a truly stellar group of panelists for today. We are glad to have with us Ahmad Binder, Director of Digital Intelligence from the DCO, the Digital Cooperation Organization. We have Carla Ri Amessaga, AI and Data Governance Lead from the World Economic Forum. We have Ana Garcia Robles, Head of the UN AI Governance for Humanity Lab. Unfortunately, Ambassador Eugenio Garcia had a last-minute impediment, and he will be represented by his colleague Luisa Gouveia from the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who will be joining us momentarily. So, before we begin, Luca asked me to address in just a few words a very targeted question. And the question is, why is the debate on digital sovereignty and AI so relevant today? And of course, I won't give you any spoilers from the DCO study, nor from the book we have just published on AI sovereignty. We have published at our Center for Technology and Society. But I would start by saying that both the notion of digital sovereignty and the public perception surrounding it have evolved considerably over the last few years. If at one point the concept might have been associated with authoritarian regimes, today it has become part of our daily lives. So even if we don't like the concept, we can't simply run away from it. The whole world is discussing this subject. And the reason for that is quite simple. In the past, power lay in physical conquest. So it relied on battleships, powerful weapons, and soldiers. And although these tools are still very relevant in the wars of today, they no longer represent the whole picture. Today, with a small yet powerful device, a single individual can attack an entire country in the digital realm and have concrete impacts on the physical world. So we have recently witnessed this in Brazil. It's very fresh, with a major hack affecting our alert notification system. And that leads us to a very important conclusion. If a single individual can cause harm to a whole country, what about a well-organized and powerful state? But just as in the wars of the past, countries need to build their alliances. They need to cooperate, and then they need to establish the foundations for strategic partnerships. And of course, we usually analyze this topic from the perspective of risks, but we can also focus on its benefits. And as we have concluded in our book, the building of digital sovereignty can also be seen as a way to drive and foster innovation, development, and even bring well-being to the countries. When states perceive digital sovereignty as an asset rather than simply as another source of concern, they tend to promote the development of new businesses and capabilities within their national ecosystems. So instead of spending vast amounts of public and private resources on foreign technologies that sometimes don't even provide enough safeguards, states can create the right incentives to develop those technologies domestically. And this also, of course, opens the door to strategic partnerships with other countries. Because at the end of the day, digital sovereignty, as we argue, is not about rejecting everything that is foreign. That would be an authoritarian conception. Rather, it is about having the autonomy to choose, without overdependence, when and with whom to partner and under what conditions. So, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor back to Luca Belli and Ahmad Binder, who will present the core elements of the DCO study, the additional dimensions of corporations, and why these issues are directly connected to DCO's work.
Thank you very much, Felipe, for the always very sharp and useful remarks. So this actually allows me to save some time and go directly to the presentation of the first elements of the study that will be launched at CPDP Latam in a couple of months here in Rio de Janeiro. So we are very much looking forward to this moment. Let me also share my presentation so that you can also have a more precise idea of the elements and the references that have been used for the study. The study that, again, I would like to thank again the DCO for giving me this opportunity to lead, and also my good friend Ahmad Binder for being an excellent co-author and supporting especially the connection between the elements of our research on digital sovereignty and AI sovereignty with the tremendous work that the DCO has already been doing over the past years in terms of trying to facilitate cooperation and digital cooperation. Now, how this study was built and on which basis actually has been developed. Pretty much most of the attendants here maybe will be aware of one of our flagship projects, the Cyber BRICS project, that has been analyzing the digital policies of the of leading emerging economies over the past 8 years, the BRICS grouping. And this has been particularly interesting because some of these studies that I have been relying a lot upon for the development of this new work for the DCO targets some of the key dimensions of what today has become digital sovereignty. Cybersecurity, digital transformation, data governance, and all the study of the vulnerabilities of digital systems and how AI systems, digital systems, can be constructed in a way that fosters local development and reduces dependency. So here you have some of the studies, some of the key studies that have been used for the elaboration of this new product developed in partnership with DCO. And the key consideration that I want to stress, and that I have been stressing also in the recent report I delivered for the Brazilian Ministry of Science and Technology, is that we have to start understanding that the digital transformation that we have experienced over the past, especially 5 or 6 years since the pandemic, has turbocharged digitalization. But digital transformation is not a mere process of modernization and digitalization of services. It has really brought a structural reconfiguration of the operational base of both states, governments, and corporations and research entities. So the digital transformation that we have been experiencing has literally determined the dependency on new digital structures, new AI systems that we see as very convenient, and they are, but they do not offer only benefits. They also determine risks, especially when the dependency we have on them is weaponized. And we have seen very recently the recent decision to block access to Fable 5 and the latest Anthropic models by the US government reminds us in a very powerful way how control on critical digital infrastructure can have enormous geopolitical consequences. And governments, businesses, research institutions across the world now rely on a very limited number of providers, usually headquartered abroad. And this is not necessarily a choice, is more a necessity. And this means that a small number of large tech providers has acquired what already 40 years ago Susan Strange called very aptly structural power. So she considered in 1988 in her book States and Market that power is not only about command and control, but is the power to define what structures and substructures people, corporation, and country have to rely upon for their daily interactions. And that is precisely what our reliance upon digital infrastructure has determined in terms of growth of infrastructural power, structural power of the various, very limited number actually of providers we rely upon. And so here it becomes essential to start understanding what is digital sovereignty, to then get into what is AI sovereignty. And finally, we will understand what is cooperative digital sovereignty. So already 4 years ago, I started defining digital sovereignty as the capacity to understand these 3 main pillars: understand digital technologies and how they work, develop alternatives, and regulate them effectively according to your own values. And that only this triad, understanding, developing, and regulating, allow you to exercise self-determination, control, agency, power over digital assets, and not being controlled by digital assets. And actually, we are used to see that we are extremely dependent, but there are some very good examples, or even coming from developing countries. And I would say maybe for developing country is easier to understand the necessity of digital sovereignty, precisely because by definition they are developing. So they have not considered the regulation of technology only through the prism of law, but also through the prism of developing alternatives to increase their resilience. That is precisely what happened here in Brazil with our PIX system, which has been very much inspired from another digital public infrastructure, the UPI system of India. So both Brazil and India, they are not reliant anymore on foreign payment system like Visa and MasterCard, which were the only choice until before the introduction of PIX and UPI in Brazil and India. And nowadays, both countries are totally autonomous. As that meant to prohibit foreign alternatives? Absolutely not, but rather to create competition. And what is the benefit of this competition? Creating digital public infrastructures based on open protocols. Well, first, it has reduced enormously the cost of the service, not only creating a national alternative, but by cutting by 3 to 5% the price of each transaction, which is what Visa and MasterCard used to charge. But also, one has to understand this creation of an alternative has redistributed the capacity to process data, which is the main value extracted by foreign payment corporations. But corporations like Visa and MasterCard, they don't earn their money, especially from the 3 to 5% they charge, but from the data they collect, from the capacity to concentrate data that now has been redistributed through digital public infrastructures in Brazil and India. And besides giving back to customers and to consumers 3 to 5% of what they're paying, which is already stellar, besides redistributing the capacity to collect data and extract value from data, this has also created enormous resilience. Because again, we live in an age where someone can wake up in a foreign government office and decide that from the following day, your access to an essential critical infrastructure is cut off. And we have seen this only 1 week ago. And actually is what the origin of this digital public infrastructure that has been enormous success in Brazil has been copied from India. And actually the Indians, they have copied it from Russia, that in the 2014, when has invaded for the first time, Ukraine has been sanctioned with the incapacity to use Visa and MasterCard and created its own system. Now, Russia did this for resilience and to survive sanctions. And India built on top of what Russia did, studied how developing countries were creating resilience, and Brazil has studied what India and Russia did it. Now, that is a very important lesson from the rest of the world. You do not only have to study how the most developed economies regulate through law, but you also have to study how developing countries regulate through infrastructure, through building technology. And that is a very important point of the study and of the research I've been developing over the past years. Regulation does not only happen through law, it also happens through the creation of alternatives. And to be able to create an alternative, you have to understand how the digital system, the AI system, the data-intensive technology work. Understanding what are the enablers, we will find this term in a few slides, and leverage industrial policy through research and development to develop alternative. And only when you understand the system and you develop an alternative, you can de facto have control over it and being able to regulate it through law. This is actually what happens very clearly also in terms of data sovereignty. I've been having excellent conversation with Carla and World Economic Forum colleagues about this. We have traditionally considered data regulation as simply adopting data protection law. That is essential, but not sufficient. Informational self-determination has been seen only as an individual right that gives a facade of protection, but that in substance are not effective. What a lot of very interesting examples from developing countries have shown is that that is only one way of regulating and not necessarily the most effective. It is essential to understand how digital systems work, to identify risks. So not only adopt data protection law, but also identify what vulnerabilities exist in terms of cybersecurity, resilience, and develop alternatives. And only with alternatives you are truly resilient. So the law is essential, but not sufficient. The development of alternative is essential to be resilient, but also to understand how value is extracted and redistribute value across the national digital ecosystem. Otherwise, as we point out in our latest publication on AI sovereignty, you run the risk to have a desertification of the national digital ecosystem in the profit of very large corporations that can hoover and concentrate value, control, and power. So with this consideration, we almost reached the end of my presentation, discussing what is AI sovereignty. And this is something very relevant. Again, I've been discussing for several years now. We have been using this case framework, I will illustrate in a moment, as a basis for our analysis of large developing countries approaches to AI and AI sovereignty over the past 4 years here at the Center for Technology and Society. And working on the previous definition, AI sovereignty can be defined as the capacity of a country, of society to develop, to understand, and to regulate AI system, retaining self-determination, agency, and control over such systems. And this definition is the fruit of an enormous frustration of most of my colleagues at the time, 4 years ago, discussing only risk-based regulation, which again is essential, it's fundamental, but it's only one of the elements that I have included in this case framework, key AI sovereignty enablers framework. The first 8 layers that you see here in the stack are the original ones. The last 4 are the additional ones that we have developed over the past months. The 9th, with the help of my colleagues at the Center for Technology and Society, and the last 3 with the help of DCO colleagues. So this is an evolving work, but it's very interesting to understand that all these elements have to be considered systemically. So data, of course, you have to not only to regulate, as I was mentioning before, but also to leverage industrial policy to produce technologies that allow to extract value from data and invest in multi-stakeholder governance to connect all the regulation with the production. And so these 3 dimensions, regulation, governance, and industrial policy, have to be seen as vertical dimensions of all the elements. Software and AI models. Again, the very recent example of the Anthropic models ban is a very stark reminder of why having alternatives and also investing in open source with regard to software and models is essential. Hardware infrastructure, no need to stress how concentrated this market is, not only in hyperscalers, but also on the GPU production and the semiconductor fabrication. Connectivity is a very essential element. Meaningful connectivity, again, a very important element. Most of the global south is only connected through zero-rated apps, typically of the Meta family of apps. That means that most of the global south has only access to Meta AI, not to all the marvelous AI products and services that could be developed nationally. So if meaningful connectivity for all individuals is not considered a priority, it's useless to invest in the development of hardware and software expansion. Skilled human capital, what we call humanware in our research, it's a very stark reminder that if we do not want a population of mere consumers, we have to invest in people's understanding of technology to make them also potential developers, and also to let them understand the risks. Next layer, cybersecurity. If we do not consider cybersecurity as a core preoccupation, we are building a time bomb. I'm personally very concerned with the propagation of AI agents, which are totally unsecure, and with the very late discussion of cybersecurity as something essential for AI. Risk-based regulation, which is the next one, is essential, but is only useful as long as it is connected with the other elements, especially cybersecurity. And then we enter into cognitive informational resilience, meaning that these very same services that are becoming so essential for our economies, societies, and democracies are also the ones through which narratives about AI are spread, and potentially disinformation or misinformation can be spread. And so the idea of promoting strong mechanism of informational integrity is essential to preserve the capacity of democracy to work, of society not to be controlled from external actors, and of economies to leverage and promote innovation. Then access to capital, that is something I want to publicly acknowledge my colleague Ahmad Binder for his foresightedness in also promoting these latest 3 case elements that we have added. Access to capital. The reason why the market is so concentrated is because it's not a coincidence. There is not only network effects, it's also very concentrated access to capital, which is very unevenly shared across the world and could be seen as one of the main obstacles to realize this notion of cooperative digital sovereignty that we will discuss in a few seconds. Industrial and supply chain, so the need to understand all the elements of the supply chain, not only to understand the risks, but also to leverage your national asset. And last but not least, technical standardization, which is essential both in terms of the norm setting, the standards, but also the industrial policy that allows to leverage research and development to create the best possible standards. Now, to conclude, we can see here from this previous presentation that digital sovereignty is not synonymous with digital autarky, is not isolationism, is about cooperating. Actually, without trusted partnerships, without scientific cooperation, without digital trade, it's impossible to be sovereign. Nobody is sovereign alone. And so it is essential, it is of essence to understand that interoperability, openness, cooperation are key, are vital for national autonomy and for digital sovereignty. And here is how we come to the notion of cooperative digital sovereignty that we put forward in this work, is the capacity of states, of societies to understand, develop, govern, and benefit from AI systems, from digital systems. And the objective is to advance their priorities, their national priorities, their social priorities, while fostering technological autonomy, openness, interoperability, and cooperation. So with these considerations, I'm pretty sure I've offered a lot of food for thought, and I hope a good basis from my friend Ahmad to take over and enter into some key and concrete recommendation on how to implement all this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Luca, very much. Please let me know if you can see my screen properly. Okay, perfect. So look, I was continuously thinking when Luca was presenting the framework and the deep work that has been done in building the dimensions or enablers, as we call it, for the analytical framework for the digital corporate or digital sovereignty, and then really enjoying the work coming from a cooperative lens, as I would say, because the discussion that we started last year when I was at CPDP in Brazil, in Rio, the discussion was, okay, so digital sovereignty and very much relevant in the AI realm could very much become a very selfish conversation, and it could very much replicate or duplicate efforts across across any countries who are trying to build sovereignty. So, and DCO's DNA, so we are a digital cooperation organization. Our DNA is cooperation. We are 16 member states with very diverse membership, diverse economies, diverse background. So we bring in a good lens of of trying to make countries to come up with some framework that works for all and enable cooperation. So the three dimensions that that my friend mentioned are regulation, governance, industrial framework. There are a couple of more dimensions that you would see in the framework that we are working jointly on. The one is capacity, so the capacity of the public sector or the capacity of the state to realize a digital AI sovereignty, and then the cooperation element. So thank you, Luca, for incorporating that cooperation or international cooperation element, although you could see it in one of the enablers as well, but as a dimension that runs across all the enablers, I think it's very important. So it's 3 + 2 dimensions and 12 enablers for the framework. So let me begin with, okay, so by the way, I will cover, so in this study, we have made recommendations for the DCO member states because we represent DCO, but as I said, we are a very diverse set of states, so these recommendations are applied globally, pretty much. So in my part of the deck, I will try to cover these recommendations from the that we made for the DCO member states. I was in 2 years ago, July 2024, I woke up 5 a.m. Or for whatever time in the morning, again in Rio. And I just, I mean, my phone was bombarded with all sorts of messages. I was thousands of miles away from where I am based, which is Riyadh. And the message was that there are massive disruptions at the airlines, hospitals, banks, organizations, etc. And it was the day of, me speaking at CBDP letter, and I was, it triggered anxiety that there was an incident that was a faulty software that had such huge ripple impacts across the globe. It was not a military attack, but a very innocent, I would say, disruption. How much can it disrupt the digital layer across societies, and how much that impact can cascade across the societies? And again, starting point of our study of our joint work and working on cooperative digital sovereignty to build resilience. So it is not, as Luca said, it is not about disconnecting from the world and build your own silos. It is about staying connected on better terms with more resilience, interoperability, choice, and the capacity to govern the technological dependencies. Based on this, our first recommendation is for the DCO member states is about discipline. So when the countries hear AI sovereignty, the instinct may be to seek national control over everything, chips, AI models, cloud, data, infrastructure, etc., etc. But the AI stack is too complex. It is too capital intensive, and hence our funding dimension or enabler that we add into the framework for most countries to duplicate it in full. So for the DCO member states, the practical question is, what should we build domestically, or what can be built domestically? What should be accessed through trusted cooperation? And then trusted is very, very relevant here. And what are the dependencies which could be managed through safeguards, the governance dimension of it? So sovereignty begins with deliberate choices, not symbolic ambitions. So therefore, we suggest that our member states should prioritize areas where domestic capabilities can be realistically strengthened and where cooperation can deliver the greatest resilience gains. So then we move on to our next recommendation, which is about institutions, and they matter as much as the laws. Many countries already have AI strategies, data protection laws, cyber resilience, cybersecurity frameworks, digital transformation agendas, etc., etc. But it's often the implementation that's the most difficult part. And the institutions, the capacity for institutions not to operate in silos and not to make the governance part fragmented. So for our member states, the priority therefore should be to build institutional capacity, technical competence in public sector, which you see missing in many parts of the world. Interagency coordination is lacking, and we have covered it in our framework quite significantly. No procurement guidance, AI auditing capacity, and regulatory expertise. So these capacity, these institutional capacities need to be built. It is not about securing the public documents alone, but but AI sovereignty or cooperative sovereignty is about how the instruments can effectively implement them. Then the third recommendation is to treat interoperability as a sovereignty strategy. So now we are not talking here about harmonizing the laws and harmonizing everything because this is not possible. But we need to bridge the gap somehow. And we believe that the gap can be bridged through interoperability. So the countries are often presented with a false choice: harmonize completely with external systems, or risk fragmentation, live in your silos. So cooperative digital sovereignty offers this third part where interoperability of systems, interoperability of regulations, governance approaches. I can give you, a very good example is the global efforts towards towards interoperability mechanisms for cross-border data flows, which is the bedrock of AI. And DCO is developing or has developed a mechanism for the countries while they can retain their sovereignty and control over how do they want to treat their personal data or sensitive data, but still giving them options and ability to share data across borders. So interoperability. Then the fourth recommendation is about infrastructure resilience. And when I talk about infrastructure resilience, it is not about building the domestic resilience. I think, without referring to any specific incident, recently the globe has been exposed to the reality where the resilience is not built domestically. The resilience that is built, so-called resilience that is built domestically, can be disrupted anytime, right? So for example, in a long time ago, we had this lesson. It was too premature, probably at that time, too early at that time, where Estonia built a data embassy, where it hosted its critical data with Luxembourg, hence making an arrangement that if there is a discontinuity or there is an event, there is resilience in the functionality of the state. So this has to go beyond now just data. So it could be cooperation on compute, cloud infrastructure, cybersecurity, digital public infrastructure, energy systems, etc. So the member states should consider, or the world should consider, building resilience through partnerships. And then the fifth recommendation is about AI safety, cyber resilience, cyber security. My good friend Luca has spoken a good amount about it, and why resilience is a pillar for enabling the sovereignty. So I would not take much time on that. Then it comes about standardization. So there are choices, right? So the standards may sound very technical, but they shape the markets and the governance before the laws are fully tested. They influence how AI systems are evaluated, how cloud services are interoperable, how cybersecurity controls are implemented, and how data systems connect with each other. So for member states, participation in standards should be treated as a governance capacity. If the countries are absent from the standard setting or standard development process, they may end up implementing rules that are designed elsewhere without their involvement. So this is a big sovereignty question on to participate or how to participate in the standard setting process. As I said, financing AI and this dimension to digital sovereignty has become very important with the wake of AI. It is very, very capital intensive. So it's not about starting an innovation hub there or doing a hackathon there or having a digital transformation pilot. It is serious money that has to be spent to the AI compute, the research, all the things that are associated to it. So the availability of money or prioritizing the money to be available where it can make the most difference is also a very important element of it. And then finally, to connect all these recommendations together, and since it is for the DCO member states, it is that DCO, I will mention a couple of or a few initiatives that we are, I will just name them that we are taking. But how DCO can be leveraged, a platform, an intergovernmental platform like DCO can be leveraged to operationalize the corporate digital sovereignty. So imagine the member states trying to answer three questions at once. How mature is the digital economy? How can we enable trusted cross-border data flows? And how do we assess the AI risk and build the implementation capacity? So these should not be three disconnected conversations. And hence, the tools that we have developed at the DCO, such as the Digital Economy Navigator that mentions the digital economy and strengths and weaknesses of 80 countries and now 100 countries across 9 pillars and 140 plus indicators, gives you a pulse check. We have AI Real Toolkit, which is country by country assessment on their strengths and weaknesses on their AI. Then we have an AI ethics evaluator, which helps the countries and developers and deployers to assess the risk map of their AI systems and how to improve that. When we have interoperability mechanism for cross-border data flows, which is a mechanism on the lines of similar CBPR and all, how can trusted data be enabled across GCO member states. And we are working on a multilateral data embassy concept as well, where it's not a bilateral implementation, but how the member states can come together and build resilience together through cooperation. So this is how cooperative digital sovereignty becomes operational, not as a theory, but as a practical operating model. And finally, I would, as the theme of our discussion today, sovereignty in AI is not about isolation. It is the capacity to choose, govern, and cooperate on resilient terms. With this, I will stop my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahmad and Luca. I think it has become very clear for us that sovereignty is not built in a vacuum. It depends on cooperation. I think that's the reason why we are all here today to try to understand how this cooperation can be built, on which basis, on which fundamental basis. I think that's the main goal. So in the benefit of time, we should now move to our 2 rounds of questions, in which our panelists will discuss international perspectives and synergies, exploring how the work that has been carried out by their institutions and organizations can contribute to cooperative digital sovereignty, and how it can advance in understanding its practical and conceptual dimensions. So I'd like to start with Luisa Gouveia, who has joined us from the Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Relations. And Luisa, I'd like to start by asking you, what is the Itamaraty's conception of digital sovereignty and how it relates with AI governance?
Thank you very much, Felipe. Thank you very much, Professor Luca and Professor Ahmed, for your presentation. Thank you also, the Getúlio Vargas Foundation team, for this opportunity to represent Brazil's tech ambassador, Ambassador Eugenio Vargas Garcia, here in this webinar. My name is Luisa Valadares. I work at the Department of Science and Technology here in Itamaraty, which is Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I hope I can convey a little bit of Brazil's foreign policy's vision around AI, digital governance, and how we understand sovereignty in this field. First of all, I'd like to apologize for these technical problems I've had. We are having some unexpected construction work here in Itamaraty, so I had to join from my cell phone. And despite these technical issues, I do hope we have a very fruitful discussion. So picking up on Professor Ahmed, previous presentation, let me begin with what we believe digital sovereignty is not. We believe digital sovereignty is not autarky, it's not closure, it's not a retreat from the world and from behind digital borders. For Brazil, digital sovereignty is the capacity of the state to govern its own digital sphere, and it does have 3 dimensions: the capacity to control infrastructure, the capacity to exercise jurisdiction over its data, and the capacity to make its own rules according to its own interests, needs, and values. And I want to be precise about the relationship that follows from this. Sovereignty is not the opposite of cooperation. Exactly what Professor Ahmed was saying, we totally agree on that. We believe sovereignty is the precondition for cooperation. Sovereignty in the digital sphere is the fundamental premise for full collaboration towards an artificial intelligence that benefits all. And the reason for this is straightforward. A country with its own regulatory and technological capacity without its own regulatory and technological capacity, cannot participate in global governance as a subject. It participates as an object, a market to be served, a source of raw data to be extracted, and a role taker in arrangements designed elsewhere. Sovereignty is what converts a country from a supplicant into a partner. It is what gives us the standing to sit at the table and help to write the rules, rather than merely receive them. According to the 3 dimensions we believe are part of full sovereignty, there's obviously a legal dimension. The right of each state to set its rules for collection, storage, processing, and use of data in its territory. But when it comes to capacity to control its infrastructure, I want to insist on a point that is too often overlooked. Sovereignty has also a physical dimension. It is infrastructural. It rests on where data is processed and stored, on the energy that powers that processing, and on the minerals that build it, and on the data themselves as a strategic asset. Brazil understands sovereignty materially. We are positioning ourselves as a hub for sustainable, low-carbon data centers, drawing on our abundance of renewable energy and water, not only as an infrastructure solution, but as an instrument of sovereignty and a strategic opportunity. And we consider what we bring to the table. Brazil generates large volumes of data that have no functional equivalent elsewhere. Climate data from the Amazon, agricultural data from Cerrado, the transactional record of an entire instant payment system, which is the PIX, and the living corpus of Brazilian Portuguese. And this is not generic raw material. It is contextually unique. Yet today, too often, individuals, institutions, and governments supply this data, frequently without clear compensation, while a handful of platforms capture the value generated from it. And this dynamic perpetuates dependence and constrains development. Our answer is not to wall ourselves off. It is to build capacity to process value at home and to insist on fair and transparent remuneration for all who contribute with this data. This is where sovereignty meets governance, and why I say there are two sides of the same coin. No actor, however advanced, controls the entire artificial intelligence value chain on its own. The chain is structurally interdependent. Compute, data, energy, talent, minerals. And Brazil is a material contributor, not just a bystander. Digital sovereignty is the lever that turns structural position into negotiating power. It is what allows us to demand a governance architecture that recognizes the material contribution of developing countries, that keeps the human being in final control of the machine, and that treats openness and protection not as enemies, but as a balance to be struck. So our message is one of confident engagement. We defend our sovereignty precisely so that we can cooperate fully on our own terms as equals in the design of the rules that will govern this technology in the century ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Luisa. I think that I'd like to highlight something that you said, and which the UN has also stated in a couple of documents. Countries need to have this adequate international representation in the spheres where the decisions about them are being made. It's not simply having a seat at the table, as you've mentioned, but having its voice heard. We need to overcome this, if you allow me, seat washing. And Brazil has been a very important advocate for this. Thank you. I'd like to move now to Anna and ask you, Anna, what are the trade-offs of fragmented AI governance, and how is the UN working to promote a legally interoperable conception of AI governance?
Thank you, Felipe, and thank you also for having me here. And thank you to the Fundación Getulio Vargas and the Digital Cooperation Organization, and Professor Luca Belli. Thank you also for having me on board. So this is a very important question, and I need, before answering, given the perspective from where in the UN I'm answering this question. So I'm speaking from the perspective of the AI Governance for Humanity Lab, and this is a very recently launched initiative that is anchored to the United Nations Office for Digital and Emerging Technologies as part of the UN Secretariat. So the lab supports all the official UN-led AI governance processes with different mechanisms, but I want to be very clear that I will speak a lot on behalf of the analytical work that the lab has done, and not necessarily by bringing the formal UN or United Nations position. I think this is very important. And before I start putting a bit of substance, maybe just to inform the audience that there is actually a couple of very informal modalities in the United Nations that are discussing these important topics. On one side is the Independent International Scientific Panel on Artificial Intelligence, and on the second hand is this global dialogue on AI governance, where the 193 member states can engage, and actually will have the first global event in less than 2 weeks as we speak in Geneva. And this is particularly important because that's going to be the dialogue of dialogue, so to speak. So we are today in conversations. There will be many conversations together, and actually the topic of interoperability, compatibility of approaches is very, very important. Now I'm going to go back to the insights that we have identified from the lab, working with many experts globally. And I think an important point, as you asked me, Felipe, about fragmentation, is I don't want fragmentation to be seen as a simple problem that needs to be eliminated. On the contrary, fragmentation reflects a plural world. And a world, and of course, this is where we start connecting also very strongly with the topic of sovereignty, that has different legal systems, different regulatory philosophies, cultural values, there are different social contracts, institutional and technical capabilities, and of course, different development priorities. So at the end, that's what links us to interoperability, because the real challenge is not to create a uniform kind of system, but actually see how these systems can cooperate. And I get back actually to what you presented before, connecting sovereignty with cooperation. I personally liked that very much, and I think we are quite in synchrony on that. And now let me answer with 3 kind of trade-offs that we have identified in this kind of fragmentation. And one I have already anticipated with this initial statement, that is this diversity versus coordination. And as I said, this diversity is not necessarily negative and allows some countries and communities to tailor AI governance according to their own context. That I already listed different characteristics. And I have to say, in the analysis that we have done, this matters particularly for countries that are still building this regulatory capacity, also policies and governance capacity, just to avoid that they import maybe systems that might not fit with them. So this fragmentation leaves them the opportunity for experimentation, local ownership, and sovereignty. And the second trade-off is more in between sovereignty and market concentration. So we are talking about this divergence, the fact that fragmentation can have a positive, and it actually has a positive, let's say, a part of the coin. And this regulatory divergence, not only regulatory, but also other levels, can protect the smaller and lower capacity states, so to speak, from very premature harmonization, or, as I said, models that are not designed with them for them. But if fragmentation, and that's here when interoperability again and the balance is important, is not managed, then it will be only very large firms that might be able to resource to comply with the different regimes. And also there will be a lot of risks that we won't be able to mitigate cross-border because of this issue. So something that unintentionally can reinforce, can support the development of different economies, can reinforce this market concentration and exclude smaller innovators in the different jurisdictions to really go cross-border and do business cross-border. So this is also an important trade-off in this fragmentation, sovereignty versus market concentration. And finally, I think there is a third trade-off that is quite important and is very connected with AI in particular. And we know AI is evolving very fast and faster than institutional and legal processes. And well, a rigid model won't work, right? And it's not realistic, and it will be outdated very quickly. And that's the part where connects us a lot with cooperation, not as a means to reach an end, but just as part of this infrastructure. And I like, again, very much this sovereignty connected to cooperation. So if every jurisdiction moves entirely on their own, this is is going to be very difficult to manage. However, is where we need really this cooperative effort, not only on the part of safety, human rights, transparency, accountability, to make sure that we can really work cross-border and globally on very basic aspects of public interest, but also for innovation. I mean, we need to make sure that also innovation flows across jurisdictions as well, and we give opportunities. So just to close, we are actually, and thank you, Felipe, for highlighting that in the lab we are about to release a couple of papers. We had the honor, for instance, to have experts like Professor Luca Belli participating among many other experts, and we are actually looking at this topic of interoperability, and we do a mapping and also bring pathways for cooperation, for really what needs to be done, not only cooperation, but other instruments. And we have also looked at how the private sector is operationalizing governance, because both private sector and public sector puts these policies into action. And well, very, very soon we will give visibility to all these outcomes, very connected with these trade-offs that I mentioned in my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think the UN has set important grounding for the discussion. The principles and ethics guidelines defined by UNESCO, for instance, they are foundational. The challenge, as you've mentioned, is how to create this common grounding, considering the differences from each country. So how to avoid the risk of fragmentation, how to guarantee cohesion, and at the same time preserve self-determination. I've been part of the Brazilian Federal Senate group of experts who have drafted our AI bill, and the work from the UN helped us a lot to reach this common basis to achieve cooperation. But at the end of the day, of course, it always depends on the political will to implement those pieces of regulation that we are discussing. Thank you. Moving now to Carla. I'd like to ask you, Carla, what's the state of play of the World Economic Forum current discussion of data sovereignty, and how do they relate to AI governance?
Thank you, Felipe. And first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Luca Belli, Professor Ahmad Binder, and everyone at the AI Hub at FHB and the DCO for the kind invitation. Also thank my fellow speakers and to everyone that is listening today. The insights gathered from our various expert communities at the World Economic Forum, including our AI Global Alliance and the Global Future Council on Data Frontiers, are well aligned with the findings that have been presented today of the DCO study, and also points alluded by the previous speakers, and really highlight that digital sovereignty should not be confused with digital isolation. Instead, a more useful framing is understanding digital sovereignty as a strategic interdependence. So this ability of individuals, communities, institutions, and states to shape data and AI systems according to their values, while at the same time retaining control, flexibility, and resilience through local investment and trusted international cooperation. So I think in this sense, we all align when it comes to the much richer definition of data sovereignty. And thinking or talking more specifically about data sovereignty, in similarly as digital sovereignty, this concept has moved from a territorial question to more of an operational governance question. What I mean is that nowadays we focus less on where is the data stored, and instead the key question has become who can govern the data, the infrastructure, and also the AI systems that depend on this data. So practically speaking, it is not simply whether data is local, but whether a country or an organization can control access, understand usage, audit decisions, revoke permissions, transfer systems, exit vendors, and sharing the benefits. So basically have control throughout the whole data lifecycle and how data is impacting the full AI stack. And in this sense, AI definitely makes this more complex because sovereignty should not stop at the data layer. AI depends on a full stack. So we're talking about data, but also connectivity, compute, storage, models, identity, access controls, audit logs, standards, interoperability, and governance. So a country that may store data locally and may still have a limited sovereignty if compute or model updates, encryption keys, admin privileges, or audit logs are controlled elsewhere. So that's why it's important to focus on achieving and seeking full stack sovereignty. This means aligning legal authority, technical control, and governance capacity across the AI ecosystem. And from an AI governance perspective, data sovereignty matters very much because it shapes whether data is used to train, fine-tune, or operate AI system that is done in a lawful, high-quality, representative, well-documented, and privacy-preserving way, and of course, aligned with local values. And you cannot govern AI effectively if you don't know what data was used, where compute runs, who controls model updates, and such. So again, the insights from our communities have emphasized that responsible AI depends on this trusted data governance in order to achieve secure, high quality, and compliant data access, and ensure that there's control on processing, there's effective consent, and also there is control when it comes to cross-border data transfers and AI deployment. And this is particularly important because AI governance failures often begin as data governance failures. So poor governance, weak consent, bias, or incomplete data sets, unclear sharing rights, inadequate security, or lack of transparency regarding how data was used. So if these are not addressed upstream, they become downstream problems of bias, privacy violations, and such. And this is also a point where data sovereignty directly links to accountability, because effective AI governance requires clear answers to practical questions like who owns the data, who can access it, can it be used for model training, can it cross borders, and such. In this sense, I'd like to also reiterate the example provided by Professor Ahmed earlier, the example of digital embassies, because these are really a powerful example of how sovereignty is evolving beyond a territorial model. Since these embassies are trusted, legally protected digital spaces hosted in another country, but where government's data, workloads, or compute can be stored or processed outside its territory, but still governed under their own jurisdiction. So this is really important because nowadays we cannot necessarily expect the countries to develop the full AI stack in-house. So the collaboration, the trusted collaboration through partnerships like digital embassies is important to ensure that the countries can benefit from everything that AI has to offer in a manner that allows them to retain control of key parts of the stack. And finally, I'd like to close my intervention by highlighting the human and community dimension of data sovereignty, because it should not only be about states and companies, it should also have a data equity lens and consider representation, dignity, participation, redress, and benefit sharing across the national digital ecosystem, just as Professor Belli alluded earlier. So I'll share a few resources in the chat for anyone that would like to learn more about this work and get in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carla, for bringing this unique perspective. I'd like to highlight 2 points out of what you said. The first is about the importance of not mistaking sovereignty for isolation. That's very crucial. And the second point is how data is key and governance is more important than localization, than physical localization. And to achieve this, it is vital to implement interoperable standards and harmonize regulations. I will give you an example. We have released a few years ago at CPDP Latam a proposal for a convention for international transfer of data in Latin America. And this kind of initiative is very much needed for us to effectively build this governance instead of focusing simply on where the data is localized in physical terms. So thank you for that. Coming now for our second round, I'd like to get back to Luisa and ask Luisa, how is the Itamaraty working to foster digital sovereignty while preserving cooperation and openness?
Thank you very much for your question, Felipe. First of all, we do have a tech ambassador, which I think is a clear sign of how open and willing to cooperate Brazil is in this field. And as I've said before, sovereignty is a precondition for cooperation. I want to now show you how we put that conviction into practice, because the principle that organizes this idea is very simple. Mutualism and digital sovereignty are not in tension, they are complementary. Common rules harmonize policy and lower the costs of working together. Sovereignty then ensures that we participate in writing those rules as equals. We pursue this on several tracks at once. The first is multilateral, and here our position is unambiguous. The UN, with its specialized agencies, is the most legitimate forum for global governance and artificial intelligence, precisely because it is universal and inclusive. We have supported the Global Digital Compact and the two mechanisms it gave rise to, the Independent International Scientific Panel on AI and the Global Dialogue on AI Governance, adopted by consensus last year. Within the UN system, Brazil chairs the Working Group on Data Governance established by the UNCTAD's Commission on Science and Technology for Development and co-facilitates within it the subgroup on sharing data on the sharing of data benefits. We also act in the same spirit at UNESCO, both under its recommendation on ethics of artificial intelligence, for which Brazil is one of the pilot countries, and we remain active at the Human Rights Council on Technology and Rights. The second track is plurilateral. Under our G20 presidency in 2024, we placed artificial intelligence among the priorities of the Digital Economy Working Group, under the banner of inclusive and sustainable development and reduction of inequalities. We carried that agenda forward through the BRICS, which addressed AI governance directly at the leaders level in 2025. Brazil fosters convergence in the OECD by taking part in the Global Partnership on AI and through the sequence of AI summits from Bletchley to Seoul, Paris, and on to New Delhi in 2026. The importance given to this agenda was shown precisely in Delhi, where for the first time a Brazilian president attended the summit. And we do not concede these spaces. We bring them to the perspective of the Global South. The third track is regional and technical. Brazil is chairing the Inter-American Network of Digital Governance for Latin America in 2026, and we advanced it in the Mercosul agenda on digital government and regulatory exchange. On technical standards at the ISO, IEC, and the IEEE, we engage through technical agencies, because we believe that whoever writes the technical standards also shapes the governance that follows it. And we also do a lot of work bilaterally. We have dedicated AI instruments with China in 2024, with Chile and Ecuador in 2025, and science and technology dialogues with AI components in the digital agendas with Germany, Japan, and the EU. Now I would like to talk a little bit about the levers of openness. We do defend open source, open science, and smaller specialized open foundational models, so that no country is locked into proprietary black boxes. We defend data for development approach, open data, digital commons, secure, and standardized data spaces. And we offer our own public digital infrastructure, gov.br and PIX, as a cooperative model that others can study and adapt. And the levers of sovereignty are used as leverage, never as a wall. Our data protection law, the Bill on Artificial Intelligence that is before Congress, our sectoral data sharing frameworks, and the Brazilian Artificial Intelligence Plan serve a double purpose. Domestically, they are industrial policy, trying access to local capacity building. Internationally, they are a negotiating instrument, allowing us to condition access on terms that we consider fit for a just global governance. And this is the balance. We try to be open enough to cooperate and to grow, and sovereign enough never to be reduced to a supplier of raw material whose value is captured elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you for this strong last sentence. It's very important to stress that countries should not be simply uh, suppliers of raw materials. Instead of, they should be building technology. And I'd like to highlight something that you've mentioned about disregarding, without disregarding bilateral relations. Multilateralism is a key pillar in the Brazilian foreign affairs agenda, and it's definitely essential for achieving sovereignty. As you've mentioned also, Brazil is championing for the global south and the openness of digital public infrastructures as PICs is very relevant to help capacity building. So thank you for that. Now I'd like to ask the following question to Anna. Anna, how can digital sovereignty, oh, sorry, can digital sovereignty be compatible with AI governance?
Thank you, Felipe. And it's an interesting question because it's true that digital sovereignty and AI governance are often presented as being in tension. And well, I won't say that is like I say, false dichotomy, but the real question that I think it was also somehow highlighted in the initial presentation is that how we reconcile sovereignty with the need of cooperation on AI governance. But before going to my points, first, I wanted to thank Luisa because she mentioned actually the UN mechanisms on the global dialogue, and I really and the independent scientific panel. And I just wanted to also give visibility to the fact that the tech ambassador Eugenio Garcia is also participating in activities of the lab, and we are very, very, very honored on that. I will enter now on the let's say. How in the work that we have done in the lab on AI governance, how digital and AI sovereignty has really popped up with many different dimensions and how they are connected. Interestingly, I will say that actually without expecting it, sovereignty has ended up being a common interoperability concept. So something that really has connected many of the discussions. So many of the inputs that we have received actually are connected through the sovereignty glasses, so to speak. So we will start. I will start talking about these trends, and some of you might be maybe repetitive. So first, there is a clear global trend towards sovereign AI and digital sovereignty, and nothing that is negative. On the contrary, I think is a global trend. And states increasingly see AI as a strategic infrastructure, and it has been said several times. So this includes also control over data, computer models, and that well gives this possibility to be a bit more independent from the companies for IT infrastructures, and as it has been done at the very beginning, it gives the possibility to decide. No. And of course, this reflects the growing geopolitical vulnerability, so to speak. But there are other ways sovereignty has popped up in the studies. First, more, and also probably already said, as capacity and development, not about control and decision autonomy, but more about also said resilience, capacity building, and economic strategy. This is particularly emphasized, or has been particularly emphasized by the Global South, the BRICS in general as well, and many topics that have already identified, like data localization, sovereign cloud policies, or something that I want to emphasize is this investment in these local ecosystems, what really has been emphasized very much by all the experts. I want to also emphasize sovereignty, I want to recognize plural forms of sovereignty. So during our study, we have seen that there is sovereignty beyond state-based sovereignty, and there are other models like indigenous approaches that emphasizes more, let's say, more cultural, collective approaches, collective consent, benefit sharing, and alternative governance models that are connected to this community. So also give us a plural perspective on sovereignty. Now, well, in my previous intervention, I talked about fragmentation, so I'm not gonna repeat that trade-off and that tension. That can be intentional sometimes, can be strategic, but if not managed, is then problematic. And then putting the interoperability back again as the solution. And where again interoperability enables cooperation, but it doesn't need to eliminate sovereign diversity. Okay, and this is not even about sovereignty, but the diversity in sovereignty, and offers this middle path between fragmentation and harmonization. Something interesting that has popped up or appeared as an insight when working more with companies, but there is an aspect very important related to data. And then I'm very happy that Carla talked so much about that. Also, Luisa, I mean, the whole topic of data sovereignty, data dignity, provenance, many aspects are super important in operationalizing AI governance, but something, data governance, but something beyond the data is sovereignty appears as an ecosystem condition in AI governance. So when we have been looking at how private sector operationalizes AI governance, we have seen the importance of the ecosystem where they operate, and the different value chains. And a lot of the principles are really defined at the ecosystem level, not even are executed, so to speak, operationalized at an ecosystem level, not only at individual level, although of course there is a dialogue in between the two. So sovereignty appears as a way to reinforce this ecosystem, these digital ecosystems, and it's a lot about access, giving availability, and also local capacity to develop ungoverned AI. That has been very much highlighted by industrial, let's say, partners and experts as well. And then one final aspect on sovereignty, when let's say putting sovereignty together with AI governance, is the environmental sovereignty. It has been also mentioned, but there is a strong connection actually through companies, because they know there is a public understanding of the impact of AI. It has a lot with the impact of the infrastructure, data centers, energy use. So there are a lot of decisions that are actually related to where the infrastructure is located, how energy and resources are managed, and how communities are affected for that. So both governments, public sector, companies, they are very conscious of this element as something that affects both sovereignty and governance. And I would say, just to conclude, that well, digital sovereignty is compatible with AI governance, and as I said, it is actually gives a common layer of interoperability per se. And well, we need in this governance to accept diversity, to avoid imposing uniform models, and to acknowledge that interoperability is not only technical, but actually that will bring these different governing approaches and allows for sovereignty and cooperation to coexist. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for showing this false dichotomy and how we reconciliate these terms. I'd like to get back very quickly to something that you've said. Although there is a global trend for sovereign AI, it doesn't mean the same for each and every country. The Euro stack is different from the Brazilian stack and from the US stack. We often discuss, for instance, the Brazilian National Plan on AI, the so-called PBIA, and this plan claims for investments around 23 billion reais, roughly $4 to $5 billion. 23 billion reais for someone starting from early stages is different than investing billions in more mature countries and developed countries. So we have to take this into consideration. So moving to our last question of this round, I'd like to ask Carla about the following. Based on the current World Economic Forum analysis, to what extent you would say that stakeholder cooperation strengthens data sovereignty?
Thank you, Felipe. Yeah, it does strengthen it a lot. For most economies, cities, SMEs, and communities, sovereignty cannot be achieved by building the entire tech stack alone. So cooperation is really how sovereignty becomes operational. But at the same time, stakeholder cooperation can only strengthen data sovereignty when it creates real capacity and shared accountability, and not simply when it creates new dependencies. Talking more specifically, cooperation can strengthen sovereignty in a few practical ways. And some of these have been already been alluded to by some of the previous speakers. First is through interoperability, through shared standards, APIs, metadata, portability requirements, and assurance mechanisms that allow data and AI systems to move under agreed rules rather than being locked into one provider, one jurisdiction, or one architecture. Cooperation can also strengthen sovereignty through trust infrastructure. This means audits, certification, transparency reports, incident reporting, model documentation, privacy-enhancing technologies, which allows governments and users to verify claims rather than simply trust them. Sovereignty can also, or cooperation can also strengthen sovereignty through bargaining power, because a small country or municipality may not be able to negotiate meaningful terms with a hyperscaler or frontier AI firm alone. So regional cooperation can pool procurement and common technical standards and create more leverage. Another way it can strengthen sovereignty is through capacity building, and this can help build capacity to evaluate models, negotiate infrastructure terms, build local data sets, develop talent, enforce rights, and participate in standard setting. This can also help for benefit sharing, and as alluded earlier, communities whose data creates value should not only be consulted, they should have a voice in governance and sharing the benefits. And this is particularly important for language data, indigenous data, health data, and public sector data sets. And the nuance here is that cooperation can also weaken sovereignty if the safeguards are weak. So a partnership becomes dependency if one party controls the compute, pricing, updates, logs, keys, or exit path. So in this sense, of course, cooperation is how we operationalize sovereignty, and we should move past the dichotomy between if it's sovereignty or cooperation. Instead, we should focus on what kind of cooperation and under whose terms and with what mechanisms for verification. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that one sentence you've mentioned kind of summarizes a lot of our discussion today, which is the tech stack cannot be built alone. I think that's become clear for us today. And I'd also like to get back to something that you said about the role of certification, which is very much under debate in Brazil right now with our AI bill, mostly as how this certification should come from public or private bodies, and how they could perhaps be a waiver for civil liability, which is a main concern. Certification, of course, should build trust and not create another barrier for victims to be fully compensated for the damages they might suffer. So we are running out of time, but we have a question from the audience. I think this question was specifically directed to Luca while he was presenting. So Luca, the question for you is, Professor, I would just like to ask whether you think the export control directive that the United States applied to Mythos will occur in other cases as well.
Well, I do not have a crystal ball. I don't have a crystal ball with me, but I can say that actually this kind of controls is very. I see it as very paradoxically useful for a global awakening and understanding that technologies can be weaponized. I think that there is only, I see literally only one very positive effect of the last year and a half of very high volatility at the geopolitical level and techno-geopolitical level, which is that this discussion that we are having now was simply impossible 3 years ago. And we are seeing as maybe a very interesting outcome of today's discussion that very different people from different organizations are reaching a sort of shared understanding, terminologically, a semantic understanding that was simply impossible 2 years ago. When I started working on this, working on digital sovereignty was equal to being a groupie of authoritarianism, and we have and I think that is not a coincidence. Was a very explicit result of a narrative manipulation. The predominant narrative until a couple of years ago was that sovereignty was something necessarily bad, a bad word, which is something absurd because it has been the basis of our international system for the past 4 centuries. So I think that something very useful of the current aggressive use of weaponization of interdependencies is that most countries are finally waking up and are finally understanding that there are risks linked with dependencies. And it is not a risk is not an insurance that something bad will happen, but it's a possibility. And I would not say to a good friend, hope for the best and ignore the risks. Yeah, that would not be a wise suggestion. I would say to a good friend, try to understand what are the risks and prepare in case the risk happen to have alternatives. That is the entire debate I've been struggling to promote over the past years, and I'm very happy. I'm literally very happy that it is very evident that nowadays we are reaching a more shared understanding about this. Is that the question of digital sovereignty is to have choices from the consumer to the enterprise to the state to the intergovernmental organization. Being sovereign, having choices, not being stuck into a system defined and controlled by someone else, having the possibility to say, I don't like these conditions. Those are not for me. Those is not as I want to live as a human, as a state, or as I want to operate as a corporation or an entity. I want to have an alternative. And now, to have an alternative, you have to build it. I always give the example of interoperability. Nobody is against interoperability. And there are some countries where interoperability is an obligation. But to fully enjoy it, you have to have something to interoperate with. If you have a nice right to portability or an obligation to interoperability, but there is no alternative, well, you are stuck again. So I think that the interesting part here is to understand that cooperation is actually in the mutual benefit. Now, that is, I think that we are reaching that understanding, and that I think that is the very basic preliminary phase to then try to do something meaningful for the dependency. It's literally it's like having physical dependencies on substances. The first phase is to understand that you are dependent, which is already an enormous achievement. But then you have to work hard to reduce the dependency. And this becomes very difficult also if your supplier of what you are dependent on is also the one that guarantees your security, as it's the case in some parts of the world when we speak about technology. So I think that I think that the times we are living in this moment, in geopolitical terms, in technological terms, are very, very complex. But I want to be optimistic. I want to believe that the very harsh realities we are facing may be the start of something very positive and awakening, for a shared awakening about technology and how we could also build different conceptions of technology and understand that the narratives that we have of technology are not necessarily the only ones that we have, but we can have also different ones.
Thank you so much, Luca, for enlightening us with your remarks. We are unfortunately running out of time. I think that time flies when we are having a good discussion. So that's, of course, due to our great panelists. I'd like to ask a very last question and give the opportunity for the panelists to spend a minute making also their final remarks. And this question, it's a very broad question. What is the general or the greatest obstacle, the main obstacles to really build and foster this cooperative perspective on digital sovereignty and AI? And a follow-up question is, what about the role of something that has been discussed today, the AI summits, such as the ones that derives from Bletchley Park? So I'd like to start with Ahmad.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Great discussions and great perspectives. So I think the obstacle, I mean, there are many, but the capacity of a state to understand what sovereignty means and exercise it, and not go in a route of something that could be called sovereignty washing, right? So we see, and by the way, this concept of sovereignty that has emerged or digital sovereignty that has emerged in the last few years, very recently, no, sorry, very actively. But the concept of control, protectionism, surveillance, market, favoritism towards domestic incumbents, all those things have been lying around, right? So for the last many years, and by the way, these types of measures might have resulted in many of the problems that we see in the digital world right now. So therefore, capacity needs to be there. So it's not about the rhetorical control over certain outcomes or certain resources, and so to build a constructive approach of what it means by by what it really means by a meaningful sovereignty. We need to, I think, I leave it a question for all of us to build tests, right? So whenever a state is exercising or talking about sovereignty, we should ask questions. Does it preserve the citizen rights? Does it promote interoperability and openness? Does it really reduce excessive dependency without closing the markets unnecessarily? Does it create the real institutional capacity? Does it strengthen competition or innovation, and so on? I mean, so I think as a next step, probably to this discussion could be, yes, sovereignty is important. Yes, cooperative sovereignty is very important, but then we need to define what are the tests that this concept could be tested against, so that we don't go to the other extreme and towards what just came to my mind as a sovereignty washing.
Thank you, Luisa.
Thank you, Felipe. We believe that one of the main obstacles to cooperative approaches on digital sovereignty is the fragmentation of governance. There's a proliferation of overlapping fora, summits, and initiatives that do not actually coordinate. And we believe this is not neutral. As you've said before in your comment, this structure favors actors who can set standards unilaterally, and favors also actors who have the human capital to participate. So we do believe this is exclusive, and that's why Brazil underscores the importance of the UN in this process. We also believe that the erosion of multilateralism and the rise of economic nationalism and geopolitical competition also hinders cooperative approaches on AI. And market concentration and these dynamics of winner takes all, in which value is captured by just a handful of actors of a few countries, and this creates powers asymmetries between global platforms. And regulation is rendered ineffective if just a few actors do have control of the whole ecosystem. Yes, that's pretty much that.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, thank you very much. And we'll say a couple of things. In one, I echo Luisa, although with a slightly different framing. As more than talking about fragmentation in cooperation, I could say there are many forums for cooperation. There is a lot of existing, not only in events, but ways to cooperate. And there is a question how to connect this, how to make a system of systems of cooperation, so to speak, no? How the global, the UN, and thank you, Luisa, for that, the global dialogue can really become a point of convergence of all that, but how can we do it in an efficient and inclusive way, in such a way that that really does the let's say, the point of convergence. But I see this definitely as a challenge, this connectivity in between this cooperation, different ecosystems. And then a second one, it has to be with, well, we all identify recommendations, pathways, we identify the challenges, we construct pathways and operationalize pathways to solve those challenges. But the personalization is complex, and it has to be also with the amount and diversity of so many stakeholders, and the fact that those are not coordinated, so to speak, towards for a global operationalization of these pathways. That, in my opinion, is one of the main challenges as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Carla?
Thank you. I agree with what everybody has shared so far. I would just add a localization trap as a big obstacle, because localization alone is not sovereignty compute, model updates, identity system, privilege access and logs remain externally controlled. It was mentioned before, market concentration will also include infrastructure concentration and capacity asymmetry as well. And another obstacle is the gap between sovereignty language and verifiable control. So related to sovereignty washing, that it's important to, in the end, like be able to demonstrate and control and have control of the full AI stack. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, I thank all of our panelists. Giving the floor back to Luca for his closing remarks.
Well, I'm very, very satisfied about this conversation. It's literally very interesting to see this evolution, and I'm very thankful very much to all the participants, especially the DCO that co-hosted with us this workshop, and with whom we are developing this work that will be launched, I repeat, at CPDP Latam in August. That will be here in Rio. So actually, if you are looking for a good excuse to travel to Rio de Janeiro, you are all invited. Some of you are already confirming attendance at CPDP Latam here in Rio on the 12th, 13th, and 14th of August. I would really want to thank you very much, Felipe, for your excellent moderation, and the panelists for their excellent contributions. And I think that what we have also shown is that there is a lot of synergies that could be built and are in the process of being built. So also we are very much at your disposal in case you want to explore further how we can deepen these synergies and work together in order not only to promote a positive vision of cooperative digital sovereignty, but also to implement it, operationalize it, which probably is the most challenging.
I think we've had a technical glitch with Luca. We are going a couple of electricity problems. It always happens when we are talking about technology. Technology takes the role. So I think that he was just wrapping up. So I'd like to thank once again everyone for joining us for this panel. It has been a true privilege to moderate this session. And we also look forward to welcoming you all to CPDP Latam. And I would also like to mention our AI Hub, which has just been created at FGV. So it will be a pleasure also to welcome you at this instance. Thank you.